gaming, the opening tutorial is usually perceived as a safe space, a chance to get to grips with the controls and the mechanics of the game. However, certain titles are a big fan of tough love. Now, let's not suggest that difficult tutorials are bad. In fact, some of the prologues on this list are top-notch, but it doesn't change the fact that anyone who gave these games a go was absolutely destroyed in the first 5 minutes. Because I'm Si for WhatCulture.com, and here are 10 video games that obliterate you in the tutorial. Number 10, Superman 64. You know that thing I said about some of these tutorials actually being good? This is not one of those games. Due to the drab environments, repetitive gameplay, useless camera, and game-breaking bugs, Superman 64 is a solid contender for the worst video game of all time. But upon playing through the tutorial, it's clear the biggest issue is the controls. In the opening level, Supers must fly through a series of rings within an allotted time. In theory, this is the perfect way to kick the game off, since players should quickly learn how to control the spandex sporting superhero while soaring through the sky. Unfortunately, the controls are so sluggish, getting Superman to pass through these rings is a torturous experience. Also, it has to be done in order, and if you miss one, you have to turn around and try again, which is unbearable due to the unresponsive controls. Since some rings are clipped through walls, it's nearly impossible for the last son of Krypton to squeeze through them. Disappointingly, players aren't out of the woods once this section is completed. Afterwards, Superman has 6 seconds to stop a car from crashing into a pedestrian. Because of the ridiculous time restraints, failure is guaranteed on the first try, and if the Man of Steel doesn't make it, well, he must endure the entire ring level all over again. Number 9, XCOM 2. Being a turn-based strategy franchise, XCOM has never been a universally accessible series. However, XCOM 2 doesn't feel like it's accessible to anyone at first, not even genre purists. Not only does it expand every factor from its predecessors, it throws in tons of new components, including guerrilla warfare, procedurally generated maps, turn timer missions, stealth-based tasks, soldier classes, hacking sections, weapon upgrades, and resistance management. Because there's so much to juggle, loyalists who have been with the franchise since the beginning will struggle to follow it all. The opening assignment features challenging combat scenarios and AI opponents who can inflict significant damage. Just as it feels like players are getting the hang of one element, 5 mechanics are dropped on their lap, forcing them to adapt at breakneck speed. If that wasn't enough, XCOM 2 also emphasizes resource management, including researching technologies, upgrading facilities, managing finances, maintaining soldier morale, and some stuff that I can only pretend to understand. XCOM 2 is an awesome title, but there are times where fans will be pining for the simplicity of the previous games. Number 8, South Park: The Stick of Truth. The Stick of Truth is an exemplary title, perfectly capturing the essence of Trey Parker and Matt Stone's entertainingly vulgar series. Even people who aren't overly familiar with the cartoon should still appreciate this crass RPG due to its creative battle mechanics, impressive world building, and focus on exploration. Sadly, The Stick of Truth takes a while to get going. Rather than easing players into the rules slowly, most of them are thrown in all at once. To add to the frustration, performing offensive and defensive moves requires surgical precision. If a button is pressed 1 millisecond too early or too late, it won't work. Because of this, our hero, New Guy, will get pummeled in battles that are meant to be easy. Also, the tutor repeats the same dialogue every time New Guy botches a technique, which can be grating. Furthermore, New Guy can't continue until these moves have been perfected. Annoyingly, this issue doesn't occur in just the opening. Throughout the main campaign, New Guy repeatedly finds himself unable to continue until he completes another tutorial. Because each lesson requires an unrealistic amount of skill and timing, players will find their progress constantly stonewalled. Number 7, Shin Megami Tensei 4. Shin Megami Tensei 4 assumes players have some familiarity with the series, since it provides only a brief explanation of mechanics introduced in earlier installments. But since this entry was released a decade after its predecessor, the biggest Shin Megami fans could be rusty going into it. Even if players are on totally points, however, with the original mechanics, it's not smooth sailing, since Shin Megami 4 introduces new systems, including demon negotiation, fusion, and alignment. If players thought they could dismiss these systems and just pick it up as they go along, well, they'll be sadly mistaken. The tutorial enemies are tough, exploiting vulnerabilities and employing varied strategies. As a result, our heroes won't get far unless the controls and mechanics are thoroughly understood. Somehow it gets worse. No matter how difficult a tutorial is, it usually doesn't have any effect on the rest of the playthrough. However, how players perform in the opening section has long-lasting consequences in Shin Megami Tensei 4. If the wrong choices are made, such as poor demon negotiation or alignment decisions, it can impact the story and difficulty. Because first-timers can't comprehend the consequences of their actions so early on, this can be incredibly annoying. Number 6, Elite Dangerous. If you're playing a game where the main character is riding a horse or driving a tank, the gameplay doesn't necessarily focus on on making it feel realistic. Instead, its priority is to make the experience enjoyable. If video games tried to emulate such scenarios authentically, it would be exhausting to master. Which brings us to Elite Dangerous. Because players have to learn about flight mechanics, docking and organising navigation systems, this spaceflight simulator feels almost as complicated as piloting the real thing. Rather than having a rudimentary flight model, Elite Dangerous implements accurate Newtonian physics and the 6 degrees of freedom. Although this is a breathtaking technological achievement, it's difficult for noobs to maneuver the spacecraft effectively unless they had experience in a realistic flight simulator. The tutorial has some text prompts and audio cues, but nothing substantial enough for players to comprehend what's expected of them. By following all instructions to the letter, newcomers will still find themselves failing again and again due to the tight time restraints. To be fair, Elite Dangerous offers flight assist, making it easier to control the ship, but because this option simplifies the gameplay so effectively, it should have been the standard option. Number 5, The Witcher 2: Assassins of Kings. As unbearable as tough tutorials can be, at least such games have the courtesy to offer tips, as unhelpful as they might be. The same can't be said about The Witcher 2: Assassins of Kings. Rather than giving any instructions, the fantasy sequel dumps Geralt of Rivia in the middle of a monstrous assault, expecting players to figure out everything themselves. For this reason, a lot of fans found themselves dying over and over moments after the game booted up. Being the devil's advocate, this decision sounds like it should be fine for those familiar with the first entry. After all, Witcher 1 lovers don't need to be reintroduced to the sequel's controls if they remain unchanged. But because The Witcher 2 drastically updated the combat and mechanics, fans of the original were just as lost as anyone else. Due to the frustration this caused, CD Projekt were pressurised to patch in an actual tutorial so that players could get to grip with the combat system before facing armed soldiers and a dragon. Fortunately, the developers learned from their mistake, ensuring The Witcher 3's prologue was very, very detailed. Number 4, Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice. As brutally difficult as Soulsborne games are, each installment follows a similar combat system. Because Elden Ring is built on the same mechanics as Demon's Souls, Dark Souls and Bloodborne, people acquainted with the genre should pick up on the gameplay promptly. However, Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice is the exception to this rule. Anyone expecting this samurai title to follow the same rules as the rest of Hidetaka Miyazaki's work was in for a rude awakening. As soon as the game begins, Wolf must face enemies who punish mistakes harshly. These foes have complex movesets, deal high damage and require precise timing to defeat. Thus, posture, deflecting attacks and executing parries are more important than any other game in the genre. As unfair as this setup may seem, it's necessary. By presenting players with tough challenges in the tutorial, it reinforces the idea that patience, persistence and a willingness to learn from failure are essential for success. Just think about that so you don't feel bad when you die 20 times in a row on the same bad guy. Number 3, The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. In The Legend of Zelda, players have quite a few mechanics to master before venturing out. As such, some entries in Nintendo's fantasy series have been bogged down by overly long tutorials looking at you, Twilight Princess. However, Breath of the Wild went in the opposite direction, giving players maximum freedom from the word go. After Link awakens in the Great Plateau, he'll bump into an old man called Rome. Rome tells Hyrule's champion to seek out 3 shrines which contain valuable treasures. Until Link leaves the Great Plateau, he's on his own. No instructions, no explanation on how to complete the puzzles. Instead, the laconic hero is left to his own devices. Because of this, Link will die a lot, since he's given no guidance whatsoever on where is safe to venture and where isn't, and to watch out for these instant killing guardians. Players could be looking at the game over screen a dozen times before they leave the place. Although vague tutorials can be agonising, this was the perfect way for Breath of the Wild to open, since it compels players to work things out at their own pace, make mistakes and forge their own paths. Number 2, Armored Core 6: Fires of Rubicon. Being a From Software title, fans expected Armored Core 6 to serve an almighty challenge. However, even the biggest veterans of the series struggle with the mecha shooter's opening. Although the first assignment is reasonably hard, the difficulty curve shoots into the stratosphere when confronted with the HC helicopter. This chopper is layered in thick armour, allowing it to shuffle off Raven's most devastating bombardments. Armed with Gatling guns and missiles, this hovering death machine can also make short work of the heroic mercenary unless they're constantly moving, taking cover, or launching into the air. Because players are only armed with 3 weapons and are still figuring out how they work, going against the HC feels like a suicide mission. And you know what the most annoying thing is? During this shootout, there are times where the boss is out of bounds, meaning it's impossible to hit it. Look, the gaming community knows From Software doesn't bother with kid gloves, but considering Armored Core is infamous for its unnecessarily intricate mechanics, it would have been nice if this entry's prologue took a more passive approach. And number 1, Dwarf Fortress. Dwarf Fortress can be best described in one word: complex. Due to its focus on construction and management, realistic physics and changing weather patterns, there's never a moment where players' eyes aren't darting around everywhere trying to keep track of it all. Even though tips are offered in the opening, there's a lack of hand-holding since the game expects players to actively explore and play around with the mechanics. However, it's difficult to learn since many concepts aren't intuitive or easy to understand, requiring players to invest time and effort in experimentation. And if modern fans of the game think Dwarf Fortress is inaccessible now, well, they should have seen how it started. Before the 2022 update, characters were represented as letters, numbers, or symbols. Unsurprisingly, this matrix coding visual style was pretty alienating. Obviously, this aspect isn't a big deal due to the recent graphical upgrade, but this highlights another problem since Dwarf Fortress has been drastically evolving over the last 2 decades. Just when players feel like they have it all figured out, key mechanics are added, removed, or reinvented, forcing everyone to relearn everything. Because of this, there are times where Dwarf Fortress feels like it never stops being a tutorial. Dwarf Fortress has been around a long time, and speaking of classic video games, here's a video on screen now for 10 features you didn't know were cut from some. Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment down below on more exhaustingly punishing tutorials. Subscribe to the channel, head over to WhatCulture.com for more content every day. I've been Sai for WhatCulture, and have a good week.